Now that I've introduced things and sort of laid the landscape, there are more good things happening in the field of women's reproductive health. Good things happening because of the developments of new technologies and natural methods of fertility tracking and regulation, and women's healthcare that's based on actually looking at women's hormones and trying to work with them. More and more young people, more and more millennials are getting off the pill in really kind of astonishing numbers, because people are realizing that the pill has, in some cases, a lot of chemical contraceptives are actually abortifacient in nature. And if you want to live an organic granola crunch in life, it doesn't make a ton of sense to be on the pill. So here today to talk about some of these great advances and some of the great resources we have locally for reproductive health is Dr. Lynn Keenan. Dr. Lynn Keenan specializes in NAPRO technologies. And NAPRO technology is new to women's health science. It helps women to get to know their bodies and in turn can aid their physicians in diagnosing and or treating 7 of the top 10 diseases affecting women today, says the description of Dr. Lynn Keenan. I'm not coming up with this off the top of my head, as you can tell. This includes lowering the risk for heart disease, strokes, and many female cancers. So I'll let Dr. Keenan explain what she does and how she does it. So I hope you'll all join me in giving a warm round of applause for Dr. Lynn Keenan.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Hopefully I can share some good news and a few new tips, but I think maybe many of you in this room may already be familiar with a lot that NFP has to offer. And again, just I'm the president of the California Association of Natural Family Planning, but I think a hat that I view as a little bit more dear to my heart is I'm also trying to I work on a board of the International Association where we're trying to brand a new field of medicine called Restorative Reproductive Medicine, where we use the natural means to help restore women's health rather than the destructive means that comes along with the birth control pill, where we're trying to suppress women's functions. So where I wanted to start, and again, this may be a very familiar side for many of you, but I am always in awe of how beautifully we are created. And so since women's health is really based on how do we affect this beautiful cycle, I wanted to kind of start with just, if you can kind of sit back and view it as a symphony as I kind of go through some of the physiology of how we're created. So at the beginning of the cycle, the kind of the master pacemaker of a woman's cycle comes from the hypothalamus, and it sends these signals, and again, kind of like a symphony, that they start really kind of slow until everything in the woman's body is kind of ready to start progressing towards a new life. And these signals go to the pituitary, which then sends the signals of 2 hormones, FSH and LH. And so that FSH and LH, the FSH is the follicle stimulating hormone. It's going to go down to the ovary and it's going to get that follicle to grow. And when it grows, estrogen is produced. And estrogen is like the main vocalist of the first half of the symphony. And it's going to do a number of things. It's going to start building up the lining of the uterus to get ready for new life. It's at the beginning of the cycle, a woman's uterus and tubes are in this kind of constant, what we call peristalsis, where it's always kind of moving, so that if the sperm comes, it will try to move the sperm and the eggs together. So it's always this kind of movement. And the estrogen, when it doesn't have progesterone, is always kind of squeezing about every 20 minutes. It's also going to make cervical mucus, which now if you could go to the next slide. This is kind of a schematic of the bottom part of the uterus. There are these crypts, and they're kind of like hospitality suites, because that's where the cervical mucus is made, and that's where sperm can be kind of wined and dined for about 5 days. So it has all the protein and the sugars, and it has these swimming channels for the sperm. So even, now if we can go to the next one. So as the estrogen is building, it's making more of this mucus that a woman can detect on the outside of her body. And the sperm, even if it's 5 days later that she ovulates, because of these kind of wining and dining and then this squeezing, it can bring the sperm up to the egg, even 5 days later. And as the woman goes closer to the cycle, that the sounds or the notes from the hypothalamus, part of the brain, starts going faster, and it starts getting louder, where these hormone levels start getting higher, until the point of right in the middle, where the follicle that has the egg then ruptures and the egg is released. At that point, actually the next main vocalist of the symphony is progesterone. And if there's going to be a new life, if that sperm and the egg are going to meet, then that progesterone has to get the uterus ready. And so if you see on the bottom, on the right side, the progesterone is going to make all the blood vessels and the glands that's going to feed that new life. Now, again, if you see right in the middle where the egg is released, it takes about 7 days for the egg to travel down through the tube, and if it's met with the sperm, if there's conception, it takes about 7 days for that new life to go into implant into the uterus. Sometimes the other side, uses certainly lots of semantics, saying it's a single cell, but actually even 3 days after conception, they've done some studies where they can do a swab and already figure out if it's a boy or a girl. So it already has some identity, and it's where's the head, where the toes is already determined. So it's really not that single cell that they're talking about. And so again, at about 7 days after the peak would be in time of implantation. If there's not a conception, then all the hormones start to decline, and then the cycle is repeated. Now, if you look at how does most of the birth control pills work, or the IUD or the shots like Depo, they're going to suppress all of that. So actually all of the hormones become very low, very flat. And that's part of what makes women women, is if you look at every single day, that combination of hormones is different. So for the men in the room, if you think that your wife is different every day, she really is different every single day. And again, each month it's going to come around, but every day we have a different percentages of the hormones. But again, if you're on like the pill, it suppresses all that, and it makes that lining so thin that even if there's conception, which does sometimes happen, it can't embed. And so it is an early abortifacient method. And if you look at our theology, if Christ died for us so that we could live forever, it makes no sense, no rational theology, that then other lives can just be discarded without a thought. But that is what happens with the birth control pill, of lives can be created and discarded as a form of family planning. So again, it's kind of that hidden mechanism of how it works. Now if we can go on to the next one. So there's many really good methods of natural family planning. The charts that I'm going to show you is from the Creighton model, but again, things like FEM, I'm working with a new one called NEO, but symptothermal. There's a lot of really good advanced methods. But what a woman does is she learns how to pay attention to that mucus that flows from her when the estrogen is high, and she learns how to chart it. So you can see on the top, she's got the days of bleeding is red. Then there's usually 5 or 6 days of dryness. Those are green. And then the days that she does have a mucus flow are days of fertility, so those are marked with the baby stamps. And then after that, when the mucus kind of thickens up, then they're dry days, and those are infertile days. So definitely the green days are days of infertility, and you can see it's really only about a quarter of the cycle that women are fertile. And then the next slide. And for women that are using the scientifically advanced methods of natural family planning, they've done a study where they looked at over 1,800 couples, and in a year they had a 99% effectiveness rate, but that was under what we call the method effectiveness, if they have kind of a teacher there kind of each day. But if you look at use effectiveness, which is the more realistic one of kind of what happens in real life, that was at 96%. And, the pill is quoted at 92%. Because with this method, people, they know which days they're fertile. And so if you choose a day of fertility, then you are choosing to become pregnant. But it becomes very clear to the couple which days are infertile, which days are fertile. And then the next slide. So when they surveyed in this study of all the pregnancies that occurred, how many of them were wanted pregnancies? Since that's usually what the Planned Parent is, that they don't want any unwanted pregnancies. And it was 98.5. The 0.5 was actually a couple that he and she kind of disagreed on that. But Yeah, that comes in to happen. And then the next slide. So, but of the couples that really used those days and they were trying to achieve, those 76% achieved in the first month, and by 6 months, 98% had achieved. So even within 6 months, if people are going to have trouble with infertility, it shows up very early that they can see that they're not achieving as they should be, and so that they can seek help earlier than kind of the standard is to go for a year with unprotected intercourse before they get that definition of infertility. And then the next one. So this is looking at 1998 statistics from Planned Parenthood, and of all the pregnancies, 49% were unintended. And of those unintended pregnancies, half of those went on to have an abortion. So you would think that, this is 1998, that with all of the mandates and with all the sex ed, with all the proliferation of, the availability of contraception, that we would be doing better. And the next slide. But this is also from Planned Parenthood statistics. This is 2014, and instead of 49% being unintended, we're up to 51%. So clearly that method has some flaws. And then this is a sociologist did a study of looking at the number of couples that used contraception and the number of divorces. And you can see that when contraception was introduced through the 60s and 70s, there was what kind of followed but paralleled a number of divorces. And there's many things that were happening in the 60s and 70s, but when the sociologists looked at all the different factors, really felt what tied closest to that was that more couples were using contraception. Because you definitely, there can be a number of reasons why people might think about that. One of the things that often comes up is certainly it's easier to hide any extramarital affairs. But there's more than that, because there's a lot of, if you're just using days of fertility and there's times of that abstinence, then definitely the couple knows it's the heart of the man and the woman that you love the most. It's not the act, because at times that act has to be set aside for the health of the couple. And there's always that struggle at times that there should be in good marriages, that sometimes it is hard to avoid, but you do it together to have everything kind of right in the order. And it's definitely, again, it's sharing that inner soul of the person means more than just to the act. But again, there's many different theories on why that statistic might be there, but it is there nonetheless. And then if you look at the number of couples that are using contraception, the red line, and you can see that it precedes but parallels the number of abortions that went up. Because if a woman is not planning to get pregnant, but she gets pregnant while she's on a form of contraception, certainly that catches her off guard, and the medical community is there to kind of solve that disaster with the abortion. Whereas couples that are using more natural methods, they're really aware of times that they're conceiving, because they know usually from day one that, yep, we use a day of fertility, we're going to be expecting this child. So, looking at the leading causes of death in women, heart disease, cancer, and stroke are the top three. So those are the ones I'm going to kind of focus on tonight briefly. This is looking at the number of cardiovascular deaths in males and females. And with all the advances in cardiology, the white line the red line shows the improvement in the mortality in males, but at the same time, women's mortality from cardiovascular disease was going up. And then there was a large study in the New England Journal that looked at a woman's risk of having a heart attack and a stroke, and then they compared it to what form of birth control that they were on. And they looked at different forms of the birth control pill and showed that the risk for a heart attack was somewhere, if they used the really safe birth control pills, 1.4. If they used a little bit more risky ones, about a 4-fold increased risk of having a heart attack. So you either go up by 40% or almost 4-fold increased risk of heart attacks with being on the pill. On stroke was about doubled a woman's risk if she was compared to somebody else that was kind of her same health risk, but then if one was on the pill and one wasn't, the one on the pill would have twice as much of a risk compared to someone not on the pill. The vaginal ring has become very popular, but that one actually had even a higher risk than being on the pill. Was a risk of stroke was over 2-fold. The editorial in the New England Journal said that we're really dealing with really small numbers. Most women are not having heart attacks in their reproductive years. And so even though the risks sound bad, we're talking about such small numbers that this is safe enough for women, and that was in their editorial. But if you really extrapolate out the numbers, they said it's 10 to 20 women for every 100,000 women per year will have a serious event, and that serious event was either death or permanent disability. And so when, if I can have the next one, when you look at that there's about 10 million women who are on the pill, and then if you include those that are on the patches and the rings, you've got about 12 million women that are on hormonal contraception in the United States. And so the rates of excess heart attacks and strokes is actually around 1,200 to 2,400 per year. And you can kind of almost compare that to maybe the number of soldiers that we lose per year in different wars. So it is certainly kind of an interesting war on women, and yet they can twist those words. And the next one. So looking at heart disease, on this one, this woman has lots of mucus and she goes months without having a cycle. This is very classic for a common menstrual irregularity called polycystic ovarian syndrome. And with that one, they don't ovulate, so they don't have the progesterone. So then if you look at where the red starts, if we actually give the woman progesterone that she's missing, and just the bioidentical, the same progesterone that her body would be making, that kind of induces the period, and it also gives feedback back up to the brain to start getting her own rhythm back in order. And so that you can see then by 3 or 4 cycles of just giving her what she's missing, that you've returned her cycle to a very normal pattern compared to this kind of top chaos. And that's kind of the goal of restorative reproductive medicine, is to find out what's broken and to fix what's broken. Not like the more common kind of approach to women's health, where we take a young, healthy woman and we suppress and break her reproductive system that's not even broken to begin with. And yet that certainly is what the pill does. And then going on to cancer, if you look at the right side, breast cancer is that line that keeps increasing from about the 70s up. And then if you can go on to the next slide. So and you can just, fill all those. The different cancer risks. So when women go through menopause, for years we would put them on postmenopausal hormone replacement therapy until we finally, because we really thought that was improving their cardiovascular risk. But that was with synthetic hormones. And then when they finally did that randomized controlled trial, that we found that we weren't helping the cardiovascular risk, we were actually increasing it. We weren't helping the breast cancer, we were actually increasing the breast cancer. But that pill that we give for women after menopause is like 1/10 of what's in the birth control pill. So it's like no one wants to draw those lines. If 1/10 of the dose is going to cause breast cancer, why wouldn't you think that giving 10 times more earlier in life, where it's going to have more time to have an effect, wouldn't have an effect on a woman's breast cancer? But we can't do the same types of studies in women of reproductive years. They view that as unethical to give them a placebo pill or not birth control pill, because then she might get pregnant. So they actually prohibit the best type of study that would kind of tell us that. But we do have observational studies, and that shows that if a woman uses the pill before her first pregnancy, she has a 44% increased risk of breast cancer. And then cervical cancer will double if she's been using it for about 10 years. And so because of that, the World Health Organization, of course, they do put a lot of things on that group 1 carcinogen list. Shift work is also on there, but still they do now have classified that from all of the cancer studies that are out there on the pill as a class 1 carcinogen. And yet 80% of American women have been put on a class 1 carcinogen for something that's not even a disease, fertility, by physicians. And then, so this is a woman who came in with this kind of crazy cycle where you've got lots of the baby stamps where she's just got the mucus, she doesn't really have a regular period, she's got this irregular bleeding. And when women learn how to use natural family planning, they become like an expert in their own body. And when things look kind of crazy, they know to bring that to a physician. And this woman had a biopsy and was found to have early uterine cancer, so they were able to intervene soon before it spread too far. And then on the next one, the woman on the top had this you really want a kind of a red, green, white, green pattern, but she's got all that red spotting at the end of her cycle. She had a pap smear that was abnormal, and then after they did the procedure for the abnormal cells, she went back to this very nice red, green, white, green pattern that kind of reflects that she was healthier. And they've looked at some of the studies of of who is more likely to get breast cancer. And when they take women that are using the natural methods and then analyze their hormones, they found that the women that have lower progesterone in that second half, when progesterone's the kind of main vocalist of the second half of the cycle, if they have lower than normal progesterones, they had a little bit higher risk of having breast cancer. Again, the research is very preliminary, but it shows us that if we really, again, gather all this data, have women be experts in their body, there's ways that we can find new ways to prevent bad things from happening and to treat it early. And actually, we'll just kind of, yes. Also, like in mood disorders, PMS was where women can get very moody, depressed that week before. And kind of the, often the treatment of choice is some of the antidepressants. But if those women have lower than normal progesterone, so if we actually give them progesterone, it's much more effective than the common treatment of using antidepressants. And on this slide, if you look at the marked and moderate improvement of treating either with an antidepressant or treating with making the hormones normal, there's a 70 to 80% will have marked or moderate improvement with the hormones, whereas with the antidepressants, they're down around 20 to 40%. And then there's environmental effects as well. And if you can do 2 more clicks. So when they made the pill, a woman would have to be taking the hormones 4 times a day. That would be very tricky to have it be really reliable. So instead, they changed the hormone by making this carbon triple bond. It's called an alkyne bond. So the top one is the natural estrogen. The bottom one is the synthetic. And that triple bond, we don't have enzymes to break it down. So that's why a very tiny dose can be very potent and stay in our body for a long time, since we can't break it down once it gets in our body. So the way that we get it out of our system is the body puts this extra protein to kind of cover up that bond. It goes out in the urine, goes into the water treatment plants. But the thing that will take off that protein and make it back to the very pure birth control pill that suppresses fertility is E. coli and some of the other things that are very plentiful in water treatment plants. So you've actually then reactivated and put in birth control pills into our water treatment plants. And they've shown in different studies that even maybe 60 miles away, there's enough of, obviously this is a sterilizing hormone, to change the populations of the fish and the frogs and the minnows. And so that's where, like, they've done one experiment where just one pill in a pond got rid of the minnows. And then Europe has been a little bit more aggressive on this and felt that if we really, because they don't always in the water treatment plants get rid of those estrogens, and if they were to change that process, it's a very, can be very pricey. They estimated $46 billion. So the cost effectiveness, certainly, the New England Journal, right before the Affordable Care Act came out with this cost-effectiveness scheme that the copper IUD, which also works as an abortive fashion, is about $129 a year. If you use the implants that last for about 3 years, runs about $319 a year. The progestin, like the Mirena, is $400 a year. Oral contraceptives are $676. They did not include natural family planning, as you might imagine, as part of the documents before the Affordable Care Act. But once you teach a woman, she knows it the rest of her life. So it would really boil down to about $10 a year. And then if she goes on vacation or loses her health insurance, I mean, she's always got that. It's not like the pill where you sometimes then don't have it. So the... people don't usually make a lot of money. You know, the church or those who are kind of teaching the natural methods. But if you look at the pills that make the most money in the world, artificial hormones are in the top 5. And so certainly there is a lot to be made for every woman being on these expensive agents. And then in terms of infertility, there's over 6 million women per year that either have difficulty conceiving or maintaining a pregnancy, and yet only about 30,000 are born through IVF. And then if I can have you go. And perhaps many of you know, but that process of IVF, there's about almost 6 or 7 embryos created for every life that comes into being. So it's a very destructive way to create a life. And then when you look at the outcomes, preterm birth is twice as often with IVF, and there's more birth defects, about 37% more. Many of them are along the nervous system. So I had a secretary who had infertility, and I had woman who was learning how to be an NFP teacher, and she was hunting for clients. And so this woman said, "Oh, use me. I've gone to 2 infertility specialists." She didn't want IVF, but she couldn't conceive. And so she taught her, and I think anybody in this room, can you see what's missing from her charts? There's no white stamps. She didn't have any mucus, so she gave her the really simple B6 and Mucinex or guaifenesin. It's in cough syrup. And then the next slide. And just knowing her cycle, just knowing what to look for, gave her her beautiful Stephanie. So the chart can help in so many ways. It can help with infertility. If a woman only has 1 day of mucus, she would not be if she has that in her 20s, she doesn't want to wait till she's 39 to try to conceive, because she already has diminished infertility, and we can predict that by the chart. If she has the second one, where the second half is only 5 days, remember you implant days 7 to 10. So if you're already shedding your lining at day 5, you're going to have early miscarriages, and we can predict it before people have their first miscarriage. If the third line, if she has this extra bleeding, she might be at risk for higher cancer, maybe a lower progesterone, which also leads to more infertility and more miscarriages. And then on the last one, where she has just kind of this, the literal red flag, bleeding way too much. And that will get her to a doctor in case she does have any risk for cancer. So it can be a great, again, preventive medicine tool to help her know about her health and prevent worse things. And then I think so there's a lot of advantages of using natural methods. Medically, you don't cause harm, and you actually find ways to help people sooner. And then ethically, it respects that life from the moment of conception. And environmentally, it doesn't kind of mess with our waterways. And economically, it's certainly the most cost effective. It helps communication between the couples. So sociologically, it does help bind and strengthen marriages. And then also respects that God knew what he was doing when he created our bodies, and you don't have to be modified to be loved, but he actually knows what he meant when he was making our bodies.